It's September 28th, 2022. Well, before I get into the main topic here about the whole issue of ideologies, which is on the title, I would like to mention one thing that is a kind of a breaking development. It appears that explosions have basically ruptured the two pipelines from Russia into Germany, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, both of which were in an inactive status at the time of this incident. And there's been a large release of natural gas, mostly methane, into the ocean. And of course, I guess it's a little premature to try to point to who did this, but I understand Ukraine claims that Russia did it, although it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Russia blew up their own very expensive pipeline, and when in fact they could stop delivering natural gas by simply turning it off at their end. And they can't really readily turn it back on now that the line has been sabotaged. So unless somebody can come up with evidence that this was a natural occurrence, which doesn't seem plausible at this stage, it really is pointing in some interesting directions as to who or what side might have done this. And while Ukraine would have a clear motive, I think it's kind of beyond their capabilities, I believe. I mean, they don't really have a seafront on the Baltic Sea, and so I don't know. We'll have to get back to that in a future video, but I think it is an important development that may become important. But what I want to get into on ideology is Giorgia Meloni being and her party being chosen to form a government in Italy, it appears at this time. There's been all these screams about fascism and that this will be a return of fascism. It turns out on CNN, her primary political opponent apparently totally denied that she was fascist, said although they're opposed to each other, that's not the case. And so, at any rate, but let's get into this thing, a whole thing, definition of these ideologies. By the way, if you like these videos, please give me a subscription. A like would help with the algorithm, and of course, you can ring the bell for getting notified. Yes, okay. I think it's been quite common for many years, decades now, that leftists like to call anybody on the right a fascist that does something they don't like. I think traditionally, a lot of times it was referred to the police in that way by people that were engaged in the use of illegal drugs, for example, that their enforcement of the law was fascist, or that the conservatives were fascist because they supported some policy that the left didn't like. However, this is mainly an insult more than a legitimate ideological description, of course. And basically what they're really saying is something slightly different, which is that they're authoritarian, that they're an authority, that they're using authoritarian tactics and power. Okay. Which itself may not be the case, but what I'm getting at is that's what it is. Fascism actually is a political ideology that basically is based on two basic principles: nationalism and socialism. So the idea of calling conservatives socialists doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? I mean, and that's of course where the term Nazi comes from, is National Socialism, and in Italy it was called fascism. And basically the idea of it is it's a nationalistic government which basically tries to, among other things, have a government regulation of industry to serve state purposes. So the industry isn't directly owned by the government as it would be under a communist system, like the classic Soviet model, but is rather still remains private industries, but there's a high degree of government regulation and control to achieve purposes that the government wants. Okay, and so that's the sort of system that existed there. Of course, the perception of this as an ideology is skewed by a clear thing, is during World War II and the period leading up to it, there was a lot of also international aggression, and of course in the case of the Nazis of Germany, a tremendous amount of ethnic prejudice, genocide, attempt to entirely eradicate a whole religious group, the Jews, and also similarly repressive things against other groups that they didn't like. But the most notably, of course, is what they did to the Jewish population. And of course, that a government could be in that ilk without having those particular extreme attitudes, let's say. And of course, in Italy under Mussolini, in fact, there really wasn't the kind of rampant genocidal anti-Semitism until basically the Germans took control of the country and started imposing it. But in reality, that area, that wasn't one of their characteristics. They were more interested in like conquering areas in North Africa and I guess it would be East Africa, Ethiopia, and so forth. That was part of what they were doing. But at any rate, there's no chance that Italy under the new prime minister is going to do anything of the sort. The whole idea is just to be insulting and dismissive. Another form that's important, of course, in terms of communism, has evolved quite a bit in China, because whereas in traditional, Soviet communism, the idea was the industry was owned by the state directly, which and of course this is a form has evolved in some ways. Let's say that now in China, private industry has actually been encouraged to a great degree, but it's also under strong state regulation, of course, and in fact the population's under pretty strong state regulation too. But they've kind of gone away from the extreme that everything has to be owned directly by the government. Private industry is allowed to raise capital, but of course the purposes are highly regulated by the government. Now let's look at our situation. Nothing is directly analogous or as extreme as that here. But when you look at the Democrat Party, the Democrat Party clearly has a degree of socialism involved in it, of course. And the other aspect of it is that the people running it tend to be globalists. One could even argue that there's elements of the Republican Party that are globalists, of course. And of course, that's probably one of the major confrontations between the Trump movement, if you will, and maybe the preceding Republicans that under, let's say, Bush or whatever, to a degree. But I think that primarily, when we look at neo-Marxism as it's being practiced in the United States by the Democrats, it does involve increasing amounts of regulation of industry in order to achieve certain state purposes that it has. And I think as they get more power, you would see more of this. So instead of, so we're looking at the idea of a globalist socialism. And of course, traditional Marxism, and even in Russia, was initially a very globalist or internationalist in focus. But under Stalin, particularly by the time of World War II and after, it became increasingly nationalist. So in reality, the two ideologies actually kind of merged in a sense, in that they both sort of have one of them was a nationalist and socialist, the other one was globalist and socialist. And of course, the movement, the so-called Great Reset, Klaus Schwab and the International Economic Forum and that stuff would definitely be a globalist movement, and it also has a degree of a socialist movement, but of the new type, in which you still have private industries accepted, but is highly regulated and controlled by the government. Whereas the conservatives and the Republicans, of course, in reality are for a much greater degree of freedom of action by corporations and deregulation and private enterprise. Of course, nothing is going to be perfect because of the history of policies in the country. We're inevitably going to have what they call a mixed economy of some form. And the question is just how mixed it will be and how much more governmentally controlled or less governmentally controlled is what most of the political battles are over. Anyway, I just kind of want to run through this. So in practice, I would say that reality, the Democrats themselves are a lot closer to being fascist than the Republicans are, actually. And you could say, well, they're also somewhat closer to the communist, although not of the old style, the Soviet type, but more like the Chinese type. That's why I would use the term neo-Marxism for it, because it is an idea to restructure something that clearly was a negative and failed system into something that they can try to revitalize and impose. Of course, that's why we oppose it, of course, because we don't want to be controlled by these people. Because ultimately, it's increasingly the case that the Democrat Party uh, is attempting to break down the traditional constitutional restraints and the traditional interpretations of it that we have. This is most notable, but the thing I've continually been harping on is their insistence on ending the filibuster. And they want to do this specifically in order to pack the Supreme Court with left-wing judges. They'll simply rule the Constitution says what they want it to say. Once they've done that, and if they have a majority in both Houses of Congress and the President, they can then go ahead and pass laws which would sweep away a lot of our freedoms and impose the kind of controls they want, impose the electoral system they want, and so forth. And also legalize large numbers of currently illegal immigrants and give them the right to vote, and then give them goodies in order to vote, get them to vote for them, and create what would be de facto a one-party state. Although, of course, there probably would be opposition parties, but there are opposition parties in, say, Russia today. And we all know that that's not considered to be what we would consider to be a good free country, right? And so, and we look at what happens where they get control of cities, for instance. They rapidly turn into one-party regimes, such as you see in almost all these major cities. And of course, the conditions there continue to deteriorate as they try to cater to their voter base in order to keep themselves in power, and not to do what's good and proper, but rather just to maintain their power. So anyway, I think that's kind of what I wanted to hit. I think that therefore anybody attempting to call the right fascist today are really misleading. In a lot of ways, the fascists were really left of their own form back in those days. And today, the difference between them and neo-Marxism is not much, is just a question of terminology, I guess you should say. So anyway, I just thought I'd kind of hit these points of ideology and terminology. By the way, I would say that my last video on the whole issue of the Russian nuclear threat issue and how it's done very well, including on Rumble, and I'm thankful to people on Rumble as well as on YouTube. And by the way, I will post these on Rumble as well. And of course, the addresses of my social media accounts are below. I post quite frequently on Twitter. And so I hope you see people following me there for the updates of what I'm thinking between these videos. And until next time.